Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I always thought I knew my husband. When we met, he seemed like the perfect man, kind, loving, and charming. We built a life together, filled with laughter, shared dreams, and quiet moments. But one day, everything changed. It started so subtly, a shift I couldn't pinpoint at first. A quiet phone call he took in another room. A strange look in his eyes when I asked him about his past. My questions seemed to make him uncomfortable, but I never thought much of it. Until the day I found something that made everything feel like a lie. I found an old military document tucked in the back of his dresser drawer. His name, but the details. Something wasn't right. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Why was this hidden? And why had he never told me about it? That's when the realization hit. My husband had secrets, dark ones, and I had no idea who he really was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like a slow unraveling. I tried to push it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. But every time I asked him about his past, there was a shift in his demeanor. He always dodged the question, changed the subject, or would go silent for long periods, as if he were hiding something big. I confronted him, of course, but his excuses were convincing enough to make me second-guess my instincts. He told me that the past didn't matter anymore, that he was a different person now. But that didn't sit right with me. I began to wonder, how much of his life was truly behind him? How much of the man I married was actually real? The questions only grew, but the answers remained hidden behind layers of carefully constructed lies. I had to know the truth. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began to search through his things when he was away. His drawers, his closet, even his phone. It felt like an invasion of privacy, but the need to understand overtook any guilt I felt. That's when I found the first clue. A photograph, worn and yellowed with age. It was of him, much younger, in a military uniform, surrounded by men I didn't recognize. The expression on his face was distant, cold even, and there was something in the way he stood, something guarded. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but it disturbed me. Why was he hiding this photo? I thought I knew everything about him, but now I was questioning everything. When he came home that night, I couldn't wait to confront him. But when I did, his face turned pale. He couldn't even look me in the eyes. The silence was deafening. Something had changed. Something dark was lurking just beneath the surface. The confrontation didn't go as I'd hoped. He became defensive, angry even. He told me that it was a mistake to dig into his past, that I should just leave it alone. But how could I? How could I ignore the clear signs that he was hiding something from me? I pressed him, asking him about the photo, about the men in it, about the secrets he'd been keeping for so long. He kept telling me it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that I had nothing to worry about. But his eyes betrayed him. I could see the guilt in them, the fear of being found out. It was like he was afraid of something, or someone, coming for him. The tension in the air was thick. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to make sense of it all. Was he lying? Or was he hiding something much worse? The more I asked, the more evasive he became. But I knew, deep down, that there was more to the story. Much more. I couldn't let it go. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the nagging doubt in my mind grew. I had to get to the bottom of this. So, I kept digging. I started researching his military service, going online, trying to track down anyone who might know more about his past. That's when I stumbled across something truly chilling. An old report. It was vague, but it mentioned his name, and a connection to a criminal network. I couldn't believe it. This was the man I married, the man I trusted with my life. How could he have been involved in something like that? I needed answers, but the more I learned, the more questions I had. The timeline didn't add up. There were gaps in his story that I couldn't ignore. And every time I asked him about it, he would change the subject or shut down. It was like he was living in fear of something, or someone, from his past coming back to haunt him. And then it hit me. My husband wasn't just hiding his past. He was running from it. It was only a matter of time before I found something even darker. One night, while searching his computer, I found an old email chain. It was encrypted, but I managed to crack the code. The emails were between him and a man I didn't recognize. They talked in code, but the content was unmistakable. Drugs, money, deals that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. My heart sank. My husband had been involved in the drug trade. I couldn't believe it. I kept reading, desperately hoping it was a misunderstanding. But the more I read, the clearer it became. He had been running a network, one that was deeply tied to organized crime. And there was more. This wasn't just about drugs. It was about people. Human trafficking. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My husband had lied to me for years, and I had no idea the monster he'd become. I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. I didn't know what to do. My heart was in pieces. The man I loved, the man I thought I knew, had been living a life I couldn't even fathom. Drugs. Human trafficking. He was involved in it all, and he had kept it hidden from me for so long. I confronted him again, but this time, there was no denying it. His face, pale and drawn, told me everything. He didn't deny it. Instead, he apologized, begging me to understand, to forgive him. But how could I? How could I forgive a man who had lied to me for so many years? The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. He had been living a double life, one that I couldn't even recognize. How had I missed it? How could I have been so blind? But the worst part was realizing that he wasn't the man I thought he was. The person I married had never existed. I spent the next few days in a fog. My mind couldn't process what I'd learned. How had I been married to a man who had been involved in such horrific things? How had I missed all the signs? I thought about our life together. The dinners, the vacations, the moments we shared, and everything seemed like a lie now. I felt like I was drowning in betrayal. I couldn't escape the image of him, the man I thought was my protector, being a part of something so evil. It hurt in ways I didn't know were possible. But I needed answers. I needed to understand how deep this went. So, I began to dig even deeper, asking around, trying to find anyone who could shed light on his past. The more I uncovered, the worse it became. He had lied to me for years about everything. And now, the people from his past were starting to find him. They wanted something, and I had no idea what it was. But I was beginning to fear for both of us. The truth kept coming in waves, crashing over me like a tidal wave. Every new piece of information I uncovered seemed worse than the last. My husband had been involved in a criminal network that spanned continents, and the people from that world were now coming after him, and by extension, me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. My thoughts were consumed by the gravity of what I had learned. I had married a man who had committed unspeakable acts, and now I was caught in the aftermath. There was no escaping it. His past was my present now, and I had no choice but to confront it head-on. But as much as I hated him for what he had done, a part of me still loved him. I wanted to believe he had changed, that the man he was now was different from the one who had made these choices. But how could I trust him? How could I ever believe anything he said again? I decided to take control of my life. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of his lies, of his past. I had to face the reality that the man I married wasn't the man I thought he was. But I wasn't sure what that meant for our future. Could I ever trust him again? Could I live with someone who had been involved in such darkness? Or was it time to walk away? The decision felt impossible. I still loved him, but I didn't know if that was enough to overcome everything I had learned. Every time I looked at him, I saw the face of a man who had deceived me in ways I couldn't even comprehend. It was like living in a nightmare where nothing was as it seemed. I felt trapped in my own life, caught between love and betrayal, fear and guilt. And the more I tried to push him away, the more he begged me to stay. But I couldn't keep pretending. The truth had shattered everything, and now, I was left to pick up the pieces. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had learned. The drugs, the trafficking, the lies. I felt sick to my stomach. But there was something else gnawing at me, something I hadn't considered before. My husband wasn't just hiding his past from me. He was running from it. He'd left behind people, dangerous people, who now wanted something from him. I could see the fear in his eyes whenever someone from his past contacted him, or when he'd get a call and refused to answer. But no matter how many times I asked, he refused to tell me what was going on. It was clear now. He was terrified. And that terrified me. Who were these people? What did they want? I started to realize that the lies went deeper than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about our safety. The life we had built together was at risk, and I was caught in the middle of it. I began to question everything. The nights when he seemed distracted, the way he would suddenly change the subject when I asked about his past. It was all connected. He was hiding something from me, something that wasn't just dangerous for him, but for both of us. The truth was out there, but he was determined to keep it buried. I pushed him harder this time, but he became defensive, shutting me out completely. The man I loved was slipping away, replaced by a shadow of someone I didn't recognize. He told me over and over again that he had left that life behind, that he was trying to move forward, but his actions didn't match his words. I wasn't convinced. Something was still haunting him, and that something was now coming for us. I knew I had to make a decision. Keep digging into his past and risk everything, or walk away from the man I loved. But how could I leave without knowing the full truth? I couldn't let it go. I had to know everything. I kept searching, reaching out to people from his past, former soldiers, old friends, anyone who might have the answers. Then, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. A contact, someone who had worked with him on a mission that went terribly wrong. The mission involved drugs and weapons, and the people who had been involved were notorious criminals. I started to put the pieces together. My husband had been deeply connected to this network, and it wasn't just a few bad decisions. It was a life he had chosen, and one he could never escape. The shock of it all nearly consumed me. How could I have been so blind? The man I thought I knew was a different person, and his past was a ghost that was never truly buried. The more I learned, the more I felt my world crumble beneath me. I confronted him again, but this time, everything felt different. The tension in the room was thick, and I could see that he was breaking down, as if the weight of his past was too much to carry. He told me he'd done terrible things, that he was no longer the man he used to be. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to hear it all. I needed to understand the full extent of the lies, the manipulation. He told me he had been a part of the drug trade for years, that he had done things that would haunt him forever. He told me about the people he'd hurt, the deals he had made, and how he'd gotten involved with human traffickers. He swore that he had turned his life around, that he was no longer the man he had once been. But his words felt hollow. How could I trust him? How could I believe anything he said after all the lies? The man I married was gone. The person sitting in front of me was a stranger. And that realization shattered me. The truth was like a slow poison, eating away at everything I thought I knew. I started to question everything about our life together. Were the memories real? Or was I just a pawn in his carefully constructed lie? The person I loved had been hiding behind a mask for years, and now that mask had come off, revealing someone I couldn't even recognize. I didn't know if I could live with the fact that my husband had been involved in such darkness. And yet, a part of me still loved him. I still cared about him. But love couldn't change the facts. His past was a monster that wouldn't stay buried, and I was now a part of it. The people from his old life were beginning to resurface, and they wanted him. They were coming for him, and for me. I couldn't escape it. I was trapped in a world of his making, and I had no idea how to get out. I tried to run. I packed my bags, ready to leave, but something stopped me. It wasn't just love, it was fear. Fear of what would happen if I left him. What if these people came after me? What if they found me and hurt me? He had been trying to protect me, in his own twisted way, but I couldn't trust him anymore. I couldn't trust anyone. The world I knew had shattered, and now I was left with only uncertainty. I stood at the door, suitcase in hand, and for the first time, I realized just how deep this went. I wasn't just married to a man with a dark past. I was entangled in a world of danger and deceit that I couldn't escape. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't outrun the truth. The past wasn't something he could leave behind, and it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The phone rang that night, and my heart stopped. It was him, the man who had been haunting my thoughts for days, the one who had worked with my husband all those years ago. He told me that if I didn't leave, I would be in danger. He said that my husband had betrayed people who were powerful, dangerous, and they were coming for us. He said it was only a matter of time before they found us, and when they did, there would be no place to hide. I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words crushed me. The world I had known was gone. My husband's lies had led us into this, and now there was no turning back. He had dragged me into a world I didn't understand, and now it was too late to get out. The people from his past were closing in, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I turned to my husband, looking for answers, but he was silent. His fear was palpable, his face pale as he tried to explain. He told me that everything was going to be okay, that he could fix this, that he could protect me. But I didn't believe him. How could I? How could I trust a man who had lied to me for so long? A man who had been part of something so dark and dangerous? The truth was, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I had been living in a lie, and now, the consequences were catching up with us. My life felt like it was spiraling out of control. The danger was real, and it wasn't just his past, it was ours. I didn't know if I could survive this, if we could survive this. And even if we could, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The love I had for him felt like a distant memory, lost in the wake of the destruction his past had caused. The decision I had to make became clearer with each passing day. I couldn't keep living in fear, in the shadows of his lies. I couldn't keep waiting for something to change when everything around me was falling apart. But leaving him was harder than I ever imagined. I still loved him, despite everything. I couldn't just turn my back on him, not after everything we had shared. But I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The man I married had been hiding a past that was too dangerous, too dark to ignore. I had to protect myself, and the only way to do that was to leave. But could I? Could I walk away from the man I once loved, the man I thought I knew, and start over? The weight of the decision was suffocating, but I knew I had no other choice. It was time to leave, even if it meant leaving my heart behind. The day I left was one of the hardest of my life. I packed my things, said goodbye to the life we had built together, and walked out the door. As I closed it behind me, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that I was finally free of the lies, but sorrow for the man I had loved. I didn't know what would happen to him. I didn't know if he would ever change, if he would ever escape his past. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't save him. I couldn't live in the shadow of his mistakes. As I stepped out into the world, uncertain of what the future held, I felt like I was starting over, a new chapter in my life. And this time, I would be the one writing it. The first few days after I left felt like a whirlwind. I moved into a small apartment, surrounded by unfamiliar walls, a stark contrast to the life I had left behind. Every corner of my mind was filled with thoughts of him. Was he okay? Was he safe? But the question I kept asking myself was, did it even matter anymore? I had to remind myself why I left, to escape the danger, the lies. Yet, even as I tried to move forward, I couldn't shake the fear that somehow I hadn't fully escaped. His past was never truly behind us. The phone calls, the emails, everything about him felt like it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to find me. The silence in my new apartment was deafening. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt like a void that I couldn't fill. I was running, but was I truly free? I tried to rebuild my life. I started working again, something that had always given me a sense of purpose. I made new friends, went to coffee shops, and even explored the city I hadn't paid attention to in years. Yet, no matter how much I tried to embrace this new life, something always felt off. The memories of him haunted me. I couldn't shake the way he used to hold me, the softness in his eyes when he promised he would protect me. But how could I have trusted those promises when I knew the truth? How could I ever trust anyone again? The darkness of his past loomed over me, casting a shadow on every new beginning I tried to make. I couldn't escape it. I tried to tell myself I was stronger now, that I was doing the right thing. But every time my phone buzzed, every time I saw a familiar face in the crowd, my heart skipped a beat. What if he was out there, watching me? The anxiety grew with each passing day. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, every car that drove by, every shadow that seemed to linger. I knew the people from his past were dangerous, and I couldn't stop wondering if they were still watching, waiting for the right moment to make their move. One evening, while I was at a cafe, I saw him. My heart stopped. He was sitting at the table across from mine, his eyes locked on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. He hadn't seen me yet. I ducked down behind my menu, praying he wouldn't notice. But he did. His face softened when our eyes met, and I saw the pain in his expression. It was clear he was looking for me, but I didn't know if it was to protect me or to drag me back into his world. My breath caught in my throat. He was still part of my life, whether I liked it or not. He approached me slowly, cautiously. His presence was like a weight, pulling me back into a life I had tried so desperately to escape. He sat down without asking, his eyes searching mine. "I didn't want you to leave," he said softly. "I'm not the man I was before. You have to believe me." But the words felt empty. How could I believe him now? How could I believe anything he said after all the lies? I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to ask how he could live with himself, but I stayed silent. His face was full of regret, but it didn't matter. The truth was out there, and it wasn't going away. I tried to stand, to walk away from him, but he grabbed my wrist gently. "Please," he whispered, "don't leave me like this." The desperation in his voice tore at my heart, but I had to stay strong. For me, for my future. "You can't just fix this," I said, my voice trembling. "You can't undo what you've done." And with that, I pulled away and left. The encounter left me shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he looked at me, the sadness in his eyes. It was like he was a completely different person, but I couldn't forget the truth of who he really was. The fear of what he might be capable of what his past might still drag us into, loomed in my mind like a dark cloud. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come. The thoughts kept spiraling. Had I made the right choice in leaving? Could he really change? And even if he could, was it worth the risk? He was involved in things that were too dangerous for me to ignore, too dark to just forgive. The life we had together was a lie, and the more I tried to convince myself otherwise, the more the truth burned in my mind. I was better off without him, but still, the memories lingered. Could I ever truly be free of him? I received an anonymous message the next morning. It was a simple text. "He's still dangerous. Don't trust him." My stomach dropped. Who could this be? Who knew what had happened between us? I couldn't ignore it. The message felt like a warning. But from who? I thought about the people he had been involved with, the ones who had controlled him, who had used him. Were they after me now? Were they threatening me because I had walked away? The fear crept back into my life. I hadn't been free, not really. My past was still haunting me, and the people from his world were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was waiting for me to slip up. I couldn't go back, but I also couldn't escape. The walls felt like they were closing in around me. The text made me paranoid, but it also made me take action. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I called a private investigator, someone who could help me find out who was behind the message and what they wanted. The investigator did some digging, and what he found made my blood run cold. It turned out that the people from my husband's past weren't just dangerous, they were still looking for him, and they were getting closer. The investigator told me that they had been tracking my every move, watching my apartment, my workplace. The message I'd received was a clear threat. I wasn't just running from the truth anymore. I was running for my life. My husband's past had become my present, and I had no idea how to escape it. I couldn't go to the police. My husband had connections in high places, people who could make the situation even worse. I was stuck, trapped in a web of lies, danger, and regret. And there seemed to be no way out. I knew I couldn't keep running. The fear was consuming me. I had to face the people who were after me, the ones who wanted something from my husband. But how? I couldn't confront them alone. And yet, the idea of going back to him felt like a betrayal of everything I had fought for. I had left for a reason. I had walked away because I needed to protect myself. But now, it seemed like I had no choice. The danger was real, and I couldn't face it alone. I needed him. I needed the man I once loved, no matter how broken he was. I didn't know if I could forgive him, if I could trust him again. But I had to face the truth. Our fates were tied together, and if I was going to survive, I needed to make peace with the man who had dragged me into his world. I was about to take the most difficult step of my life, and I wasn't sure I could live with the consequences. But it was the only way. I went back to him. I couldn't keep running. I needed answers, I needed closure, and I needed to know if we could survive this together, or if I needed to walk away once and for all. When I knocked on his door, it felt like everything had come full circle. He answered quickly, almost as if he had been waiting for me. The look in his eyes was one of both relief and fear. He let me inside without a word, and we sat down in silence. I didn't know where to start. So many questions, so many emotions. But the first words I spoke were simple. I need your help. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't hesitate. He told me everything. Everything about the people he had betrayed, the danger they posed, and how they were closing in on us both. It wasn't enough to redeem him, but it was the beginning of something. Something I wasn't sure I could handle, but something I had to face. As we worked together to find a way out, I realized something. I had been holding on to my anger, my pain, but I had also been holding on to my fear. The fear of being hurt again, the fear of being deceived, had kept me from seeing the bigger picture. We were both trapped, but we were still alive. And as much as I hated the darkness that had defined his past, I couldn't ignore the man standing before me now. He was broken, yes, but there was something in his eyes that told me he was trying to make things right. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe there was a chance, maybe we could survive this. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't do it alone, and neither could he. As we started to work together, the weight of our shared secret became heavier. Every plan we made was built on fragile trust. I could feel the heaviness of his past pulling at both of us, but there was a certain raw honesty between us now, something we hadn't had before. He wasn't the man I once thought I knew, but he was trying. He was doing everything he could to keep us safe, even if it meant exposing himself to the people who might end his life. The more we spoke, the more I began to understand the depth of his past. It wasn't just about the drug deals or the trafficking. It was about survival. He'd been caught in a system that chewed people up and spit them out, and he'd done what he could to survive. But now, I saw the pain in his eyes as he realized that survival had come at a cost, his humanity. And I was the one left to deal with the aftermath. The question wasn't just whether we could escape. It was whether I could live with what he had become. The situation grew more dangerous with every passing day. The people from his past were ruthless, and I knew they wouldn't stop until they found him, or me. We had to move fast, to disappear, but I wasn't sure where we could go anymore. My heart was torn between the fear of leaving everything behind and the fear of staying. I kept asking myself, could we ever outrun what was coming for us? Every time we made a step forward, it felt like we were taking 2 steps back. The messages kept coming, cryptic warnings, threats. They knew we were getting closer to escaping, and they weren't going to let us go that easily. My husband was taking extreme measures to protect us, but even his resources seemed limited. The men he had once worked with were closing in, and I could feel the walls around us tightening. There was nowhere to hide, and every time I thought we might be safe, the next danger seemed to strike harder. I began to notice something unsettling. He was changing again, not in the way he had before, but in a darker way. There was a distance between us, an almost eerie calmness to his actions. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the situation, but it was more than that. It was like he had accepted his fate. The man who had once been desperate to protect me now seemed resigned to the fact that the past would catch up with him eventually. He didn't talk much anymore, and when he did, it was with an edge of finality. I couldn't help but wonder if he was preparing for the worst. Was he planning to leave me behind? Or was he protecting me by distancing himself? My mind raced with questions, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew. Was he still the man I loved, or had the darkness consumed him completely? I didn't know how to reach him, and it terrified me. If I couldn't reach him, how could I save us? Things came to a head one night when we were forced to move again. The tension was palpable. We packed in silence, the urgency of the moment hanging over us like a suffocating cloud. He told me to be ready. He had arranged for us to leave the city, to disappear for good. But there was a coldness in his voice, a detachment I hadn't heard before. I followed him through the dark streets, but something didn't feel right. I could feel the unease growing in my chest, like a knot tightening with every step. When we reached the car, he didn't open the door for me as he usually did. Instead, He just stood there, looking at the street, as if waiting for something. It felt like we were waiting for the inevitable. And then it hit me. He was preparing me for the worst. For a life where there would be no more running, no more escaping. A life where we would be trapped forever, and our only option would be to face the consequences of everything we had done. I realized that I wasn't just in danger from the people who had once controlled him. I was in danger from him too. His silence spoke volumes. I didn't know who he was anymore. Just as I was about to ask what was happening, a car screeched around the corner, headlights blinding us. My heart pounded in my chest as two men got out, their faces covered, their presence menacing. They were here, the ones who had been chasing us. The time for running was over. I could see it in my husband's eyes. He had made a choice, and it wasn't one I was prepared for. He stepped forward, blocking my view of the men. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice steady but cold. I wanted to scream, to tell him to come back, but I didn't. I was paralyzed by fear, watching as he faced the men who had once been his allies, but now were his enemies. He had left that life behind, or so he said, but it seemed like it was still pulling him in. These men weren't just here for him. They were here for us, to take back what they thought they were owed. I watched as they spoke in hushed tones, their movements quick and calculated. Was this it? Was this the moment everything came crashing down? As the tension escalated, I realized that there was no escape anymore. My husband was no longer the man I had known. He was someone else, someone who had been shaped by violence, by choices that I could never understand. The darkness that had once been his secret was now an open wound, and I was caught in the crossfire. The men started to approach us, their footsteps heavy, their intentions clear. But just as I thought everything was over, my husband made a sudden move, pulling me away from the danger and towards a hidden alleyway. "We need to go. Now," he said urgently. His face was tight with fear and anger, but it wasn't just fear for his life. It was fear for mine. He wasn't the same man who had lied to me, who had dragged me into his world. In that moment, I realized something. He was still trying to protect me, even if it meant facing his own past. But was it enough? Could I trust him again? As we ran, my heart pounded with uncertainty. The danger wasn't over, and neither was the emotional storm that was swirling inside me. But for the first time, I saw a glimpse of the man I had once loved, a man fighting for survival, fighting for us. We found ourselves in a safe house, one of the few places that still remained off the grid. I couldn't breathe. The adrenaline still coursed through me, and my mind was racing. My husband had done what he could to protect us, but I could tell that the fight wasn't over. The people who had been chasing us were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that even though I had been running, I hadn't been alone. He had been there, fighting for us, protecting me in his own way. I didn't know if that made him a hero or a villain, but I knew one thing for sure. He was the only one I could count on now. There was no going back, no running from the past. We had to face it, together. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew we had one last chance to make it out alive, and I wasn't going to waste it. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. We moved constantly, never staying in one place too long. Every time I thought we were safe, the threat would resurface. But something had changed between us. The walls I had built around my heart were beginning to crumble. My husband wasn't perfect, and I wasn't sure I could ever fully forgive him for the lies and the danger. But I knew we had been through too much together. We had shared something real, something worth fighting for. As we sat together one night, exhausted from the constant moving, I realized that maybe the love we had wasn't dead. It wasn't the same, but it was still there. Maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild it from the ashes. But only if we survived what was coming next. The past was never truly behind us, and I had to decide whether I was willing to face it head-on, whether I could love him again, despite everything. We couldn't stay in the safe house forever. The danger was closing in on us, and with each passing hour, I felt the weight of our situation bearing down on us. My mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. We were running out of options, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep this up. My husband, though, had become a man with purpose. He wasn't the same as before. He had changed in ways I didn't fully understand. There was a strength in him now, a clarity that had been missing. But even with that strength, I knew that the danger we were facing was bigger than either of us. He had told me that he had a plan, but the more I heard him talk, the more I realized just how deep we were in. The web of his past wasn't just about him anymore. It had ensnared us both. I didn't know if I could trust his plan, but it was the only one we had. We had no choice but to follow through. The plan was risky, but it was our only shot. We needed to disappear completely. No more hiding in the shadows. We had to cut every tie to the world we had known and start fresh, far away from everything. I knew that would mean leaving behind friends, memories, even pieces of myself. But there was no other way. We had to sever all connections, erase every trace of our existence. My husband had contacts, dangerous ones, but he was willing to risk everything to keep me safe. As we discussed the details of our escape, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Could I really walk away from everything? From the life I had tried to rebuild? From the person I had become in this new world? The thought of it made me feel like I was losing my identity. But I had no choice. We couldn't stay in hiding forever. The longer we stayed, the closer the danger came. It was time to face the truth. Our lives as we knew them were over. The night before we were supposed to leave, my heart was a storm of emotions. Fear, sadness, and uncertainty filled every inch of me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop pacing around the room. My mind kept racing. Would we make it out? Would we survive this? I kept remembering the man he used to be, the man I had loved. Was that man still inside him? Or had the darkness completely consumed him? I couldn't tell anymore. The man who had once promised me a future now seemed like a stranger, someone I didn't fully understand. He had sacrificed so much for us to survive, and now he was willing to give up even more. But how much more could we lose? I wasn't sure if I could follow through with this plan, if I could truly walk away from everything I had known. But as I looked at him, his tired eyes, the lines on his face from years of stress, I realized something. Maybe we weren't running away from our past. Maybe we were running towards a chance at a future together, a future where we could rebuild. The escape began at dawn. There was no time to waste. My husband had arranged everything down to the smallest detail, where we would go, how we would get there. We moved quickly, efficiently, without looking back. There were moments when I thought I saw shadows in the distance, figures that seemed to be watching us, but I kept my focus forward. I couldn't afford to be distracted by fear. Not now. Not when everything depended on this one chance. We drove for hours, crossing state lines, changing our identities, erasing every trace of our past. My heart pounded in my chest, but there was also something else, something I hadn't expected: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a shot at something. Maybe it was possible to rebuild. Maybe, if we were lucky, we could outrun our past. By the time we reached our destination, I felt like I was in a different world. We were far from the chaos we had left behind, hidden in a quiet town where no one knew our names. We rented a small apartment in a nondescript building, a place where we could lay low for a while. I couldn't help but feel a sense of disorientation. We had made it, but now what? What would our lives look like in this new place, where no one knew who we were? It felt like starting over, but starting over in a world where we both carried the weight of our pasts. I couldn't forget what he had done, but I also couldn't ignore the sacrifices he had made to get us here. Was it enough to make a new beginning? As we sat in the small, empty apartment, I looked at him. He was exhausted, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He hadn't given up, even after everything that had happened. And neither had I. We were here, and we had a chance. But it wasn't going to be easy. We would have to fight for this life. Together. The first few weeks in the new town were a blur. We settled into a routine. Work, errands, quiet evenings. It was normal, peaceful even. But underneath it all, I could still feel the weight of our past pressing down on us. My husband had gone to great lengths to protect us, but there was a part of me that knew we couldn't stay hidden forever. The people from his past wouldn't just forget about us. I started to see signs, small things at first. A car parked outside our apartment building at odd hours. Strange phone calls. It was like the past was slowly catching up with us again. I could feel the tension growing between us, the unspoken fear that we weren't as safe as we had hoped. We couldn't outrun our past forever. Sooner or later, it would catch up to us. And when it did, would we be ready? I wasn't ready. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew deep down that we weren't prepared for what was coming. My husband had been trying to keep us safe, but I could see the cracks forming. The fear was in his eyes now, too. He wasn't invincible. He had made enemies, and those enemies didn't forget. As the days passed, the signs became more obvious. The whispers in the shadows, the menacing presence that seemed to linger at the edge of our lives. It was all too much. The past wasn't something we could leave behind. It was like a shadow that followed us, no matter where we went. We had tried to outrun it, to start fresh, but now I realized that there was no escaping it. The only thing left to do was face it head-on. We couldn't keep running. We needed a plan, a way to confront the people who had been chasing us all this time. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. I confronted him one night, after days of feeling the weight of his silence. We were sitting in our apartment, the walls closing in around us, when I couldn't take it anymore. "What's really going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're not telling me everything. I can feel it." He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They're closer than we thought. They've been tracking us. I'm trying to keep you safe, but I can't do it alone." The fear in his voice was undeniable. The truth was out now, and it was scarier than I had imagined. We were running out of time. The danger was here, and there was no hiding from it anymore. We had to make a stand, and we had to do it together. The reality of our situation hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had believed we could escape, that we could outrun his past, but now I saw the truth. There was no running from this, no hiding. My husband had been trying to shield me, to protect me from the consequences of his past, but in doing so, he had kept me in the dark. And now we were both trapped in a web of danger that we couldn't untangle alone. The people who had once been his allies were closing in. There was no way out except through them. The time had come to face the demons of his past head-on. I had to decide if I could stand by him, knowing the truth about who he really was. Could I forgive him for the lies? Could I trust him again after everything? Or was it too late to salvage anything between us? The next few days felt like we were living in a haze of fear. We couldn't leave the apartment anymore. Every time we went outside, we felt the weight of eyes on us. It was only a matter of time before the people from his past found us. My husband was quiet, his mind clearly racing with plans and contingencies, but I could feel the tension between us. He knew what was coming, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I had been holding on to the hope that we could escape, that we could rebuild. But now, I realized that wasn't an option. We couldn't escape the past. It would come for us, whether we were ready or not. And all I could do was wait and hope we survived. One night, as we sat in the dim light of our apartment, there was a knock on the door. My heart stopped. My husband stood up slowly, his eyes dark and full of emotion. I could see the fear in them now, the same fear that had been gnawing at me for so long. He opened the door, and in walked two men, familiar faces, cold and unforgiving. The past had caught up with us. They had come to settle old scores. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stood frozen in place. My husband stood between me and them, his posture tense, ready for whatever was coming. "You've got nowhere left to run," one of the men said, his voice icy. "It's time to pay for what you've done." My husband didn't flinch. He wasn't the same man I had known before. He had hardened, become someone I didn't fully recognize. "I've paid," he said, his voice steady, "and I'll pay whatever else it takes to keep her safe." The men left, but not without a warning. My husband was right. They weren't going to stop. They would keep coming, and they would drag us back into the hell of his past if we didn't find a way to fight. We couldn't keep running, but we also couldn't face them alone. The next few days were a blur of decisions, life-changing, heart-wrenching decisions. My husband contacted the few people from his past who might still owe him favors, people who could help us face down the men who were hunting us. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all we had left. The final confrontation loomed over us, and as I stood beside him, ready to face whatever came next, I realized something. We had been running for so long, but now we were no longer running. We had fought for our lives, for our love, and for a chance at a future together. In that moment, with all the danger still surrounding us, I knew one thing. No matter what happened, we had survived. And that meant we still had a chance. A chance at redemption, at healing, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at love again.